The Murid War was the eastern phase of the Caucasian War, in which Russia gained control of the independent peoples of the Caucasus Mountains. When the Russians annexed Georgia in 1801, they had to control the Georgian Military Highway in the exact center, which was the only practical route south across the mountains. This divided the war into two parts. In the western Russo-Circassian War, the tribes did not unite and the war was very complex. In the east, the tribes joined in the Caucasian Armati, a military theocratic state which held out for 30 years. This state was created by Qazi Mullah in 1829 to 1832 and ruled by Imam Shamil from 1834 to 1859. Background. Geography. The region of fighting was a rough triangle, a rectangle about 150 by 200 kilometers. The northern boundary was the east-flowing Terek River. The eastern boundary was inland from the Caspian Sea, where the foothills meet the Caspian Plain. The southern boundary was at most the Samur River, but much of the south was under some degree of Russian control. The southwestern boundary was the crest of the Caucasus. This area was inaccessible and was only crossed by a few raids into Georgia in the far south. The western boundary was the Georgian Military Highway. At first, most of the fighting was within a 50 or 75-kilometer radius of Gyumri. After 1839, the center of resistance moved northwest to the forests of Chechnya. The basic distinction is between the forests of Chechnya in the northwest and the high and barren plateaus of Dagestan in the east. In Dagestan, just north of Gyumri, the east-flowing Andi-Koisu joins the north-flowing Avar-Koisu to form the Sulik River, which flows north and then east. All three flow in very deep canyons. To the east, plateaus and canyons run down to the narrow coastal plain of the Caspian Sea. To the south are more plateaus, canyons and mountains. This region is called Avaria from its major language and was partly ruled by the Avar Khanate at Kunzik and the Kazakama Khanate further south. North of Gyumri and the Andi-Koisu is the Salatau Plateau, and west of it is a lower area marked by the village of Andi. North of these are the forested north-south valleys of Chechnya, a region called the Chguria. At about the line of the Terek, the forests give way to steppe. The Chechens used this for winter pasture until the Russians pushed them south. Between the Terek and the mountains was a 30 to 70 kilometers belt of forested flat country which has now been cleared for agriculture. The western boundary is the Georgian Military Highway, which follows the north-flowing upper Terek River. The northwest bend of the Terek was the main area where forest cutting and Cossack villages were pushed southeast into the Chechen forests. The war as a siege. Veliaminov, Yermolov's chief of staff, described the Caucasus as an enormous fortress with a 600,000-man garrison which could not be taken by storm and could only be taken by siege. The Caucasus War was basically a 60-year-long siege. The many campaigns into the interior only served to wear the mountaineers down and did not result in permanent occupation until the last year or so. Fighting in the lowlands, the Russian infantry had little difficulty with flat country that had been cleared for agriculture. These areas often had rulers who could be pressured and subjects who were used to obedience. Fighting in the forests of Chechnya. In the northwest, Chechnya extends from the high mountains down through a series of north-south valleys to the flat country. The whole region was forested to about the Terek River. The Russians could easily send a raiding party into the forest, burn a few villages and withdraw, but anything larger was nearly impossible. A large force with its baggage train would string out for a mile or more along a forest path where it would be attacked from both sides as soon as the mountaineers gathered enough men. This required skirmish lines on both sides, the so-called column in a box. A large force could fight its way through or out, but at unacceptable cost. The only safe way to move through the forest was to cut down the trees for musket shot on both sides of the road. Many of the trees were large beech trees that were hard to cut down and provided excellent sniper roosts. Forest cutting was a major activity during the whole period. Since lowland Chechnya is good farmland, Cossack military agricultural villages were pushed southward as the trees were cut down. Forest fighting extended all along the North Caucasus and merged into the Caucasian War further west. The Russians preferred to fight in winter when there was less cover. Fighting in the mountains of Dagestan. In the east, Dagestan was higher and drier with only patches of forest. Especially in the north, it was a system of plateaus cut by deep gorges. Villages were usually built on crags. Houses were of stone with loopholes and interlocked so that the whole village was a fort. Some were built stair-step-wise up the side of a hill so that a storming party needed ladders to move from one house to the next. These could be taken by storm at great cost or blasted open with artillery. Lack of firewood made permanent occupation difficult. The best time for the Russians was high summer when the snow had melted and there was grass for the horses. Between two fires, each village or khanate was effectively independent. If it wanted to resist, it had to consider how many soldiers the Russians could bring to the area. But if it submitted, it could expect a counter-attack from Shamil. Pacified villages had varying degrees of autonomy which changed with time, especially on the edges. Many villages changed sides several times depending on which side was most threatening. Outline: Qazi Mullah established the imamate, was unable to capture the Avar Khanate to the southwest and died in battle. Gamzat Bek captured the Avar Khanate and was killed in revenge for his murder of the Avar ruling family. Shamil gained power and in 1839 was besieged for 80 days in the rock fortress of Akalgo. The night the place fell, he escaped with a few men. In 1840 he re-established himself in Chechnya. By 1843 he held most of Dagestan. In 1845 Vorontsov was nearly annihilated when he tried to penetrate the Chechen forest. In 1846 Shamil failed to take Kabadia to the west. In 1847 to 1857 things were stable. The Russians sent a number of expeditions into Dagestan, usually taking a village and withdrawing. In Chechnya the steady process of deforestation continued. In 1858 the Russians captured the Argon Valley, cutting Chechnya in half. In 1859 resistance collapsed and Shamil surrendered and went into honorable exile at Kaluga and died in 1871 on a pilgrimage to Mecca. The origins of Muradism. There had been a few Cossacks on the Terek River since about 1520. From 1800 to 1830 the Russians annexed Georgia south of the mountains, gained control of the Khanates along the Caspian coast and built up the Caucasian line of forts along the northern edge of the mountains. With the end of the Turkish and Persian wars in 1829 they could turn the full attention to the mountains. There had always been Sufi groups in the area, especially in Dagestan. Of these, the Naqshbandi order was noted for the strict adherence to religious law and the duty of a Murid disciple to his teacher a Murshi. Although this was purely spiritual, under Russian pressure it became merged with the idea of Gazivat and Jihad, a holy war. The ideas of religious duty, obedience to a master, strict religious law and holy war became the basis of a military theocratic state that resisted the huge Russian Empire for 30 years. Religion was important for holding together the many independent clans and villages. But note that the Circassians held out even longer without the aid of a theocratic state. Gamma gives a complex account of the religious origin of the movement which will not be reproduced here. Note that the Russians used the term Murid for any follower of Shamal without regard for the word's religious meaning. Imam Qazi Mullah 1829–1832. All dates are Old Style, so at 12 days for the Western calendar. To help with the numerous place names, each place will be given by its approximate distance and direction from Gyumri. Thus the Caspian Sea is 70 km east and Dargo is 50 km northwest. Qazi Mullah was born at Gyumri around 1793 and grew up with Shamal, who was a few years younger. He studied theology at Karani and Arakani and began to preach at Gyumri in 1827. His fame grew and he was invited to Turkey and Kazakhstan. By the end of 1829, many of the people of Inner Dagestan were his followers. At first preaching Shariat, his thought turned increasingly to holy war, which he first preached openly at the end of 1829. 1830, his first military move was to attack his former teacher Safid of Arakani, who opposed his preaching. He took the town, burned Safid's books and poured out all the wine in town. Safid escaped and took refuge in with Asian Khan of Kazakhstan. He took Karnar and Erpili and then Matla, where he shot a Qadi for disobedience. At a meeting at Gyumri attended religious leaders from all over Dagestan, he was proclaimed Imam. This nascent religious state clashed with the political of Varkhanate at Kunzik. On the 4th of February he led 3,000 men to Andi, gained more support and marched on Kunzik, where he was defeated with a loss of 200 dead and 60 prisoners. See Battle of Kunzik. In May 1830, Baron Rosen with 6,000 men marched on Gyumri, dared not attack it, looted the local herds and withdrew. In September to October he went to Chechnya to consolidate relations. In May and December the Alazani River Valley in Georgia was raided. 1831. In February to March Qazi Mullah took a position in the forest of Chumkeskan where he could defend Gyumri and strike in any direction. Two attempts to dislodge him failed in April, as did a third attempt in May. These successes may have led them to think they could hold a fixed position, contributing to the disaster at Akulgo 8 years later. About this time some Russian forces along with General Paskevich were withdrawn to deal with the Polish uprising. Taking advantage of this, in May 1831 Qazi Mullah captured Turkey under the guns of Fort Bernard but was driven back to Chumkeskan by reinforcements. In June he besieged Fort Venezapnar and then withdrew to a forest followed by General Emanuel and 2,500 Russians. He killed or wounded 400 of them, wounding the general, and returned to Chumkeskan. For 8 days in August he besieged Debent at the request of the people of Tabasaran. Note that Qazi Mullah fought aggressively, sending columns in all directions, while Shamal fought defensively, holding the center and waiting for the Russians to attack him. Around October the Russians attacked the Salatau Plateau, but Qazi Mullah drew them off by threatening Grozny. On November 1, he sacked Kizlyar and took 200 prisoners, mostly women. On 01 Dekmika Lashevsky captured Chumkeskan, taking no prisoners. The Russians began building the Lesguiad Line in the far south. 1832. Things were quiet until spring. In April 1832, he went to Chechnya, threatened Vladimir Ukaz and besieged Nuzran. It is said that Qazi Mullah advised the Chechens to withdraw to the forests and cultivate maize instead of wheat. Another force achieved the submission of the southern part of Chechnya. These new recruits killed some Orthodox missionaries and raided the Georgian Military Highway. The Russians responded by sending 3,000 men to the roadless Galgai country near the mountain crest southeast of Vladimir Ukaz. At one point the expedition was held up for 3 days by a defensive tower manned by exactly 2 men. The village of Sori was destroyed the following day and the expedition returned returned to Vladikar-Ukaz. In August 1832, Rosen and Veliaminov harried Lower Chechnya, as they had been doing for several years. On the 18th, Qazi Mullah had his last success. He raided near Amir Haji Yurt on the Terek, drew 500 Cossacks into a forest and killed 106 of them, including the commander. In Chechnya, Jacques was taken, and then Veliaminov went deep into the forests and took Dargad, a place that was not yet important. These expeditions destroyed 61 villages and received the submission of 80 more at a cost of 17 Russian dead and 351 wounded. Qazi Mullah and Shamil retired to Gyumri and prepared for a major attack. There was talk of a truce which the Russians rejected. At the Battle of Gyumri, a sudden Russian advance trapped 60 Murids in a fortified house. Nearly all were killed, only 2 escaping. That night the Russians learned that one of the dead was Qazi Mullah. One of the 2 who escaped was Shamil. Imam Hamzad Bek (1832–1834). Hamzad Bek was born in Gotsatl, 14 kilometers east of Kunzik, in 1789. He was a Janka, or son of a nobleman by a commoner. His father was an administrator and raider into Georgia. Pakubaika, the late Khan's widow, arranged for his education. He took to drink but was reformed by Qazi Mullah and became a military leader in the south. In 1830 he raided into Georgia, went to the Russian camp to negotiate and was arrested. He owed his release to both the Russians who wanted to use him against the Imam and Asian Khan of Kazakhamuk who hoped to use him against Pakubaika. He rejoined the Imam and continued raiding in the south. He was in command of Chumkesk, and when the place was taken, at the Battle of Gyumri, he was blocked from reinforcing Qazi Mullah. At Qazi Mullah's death, and with Shamil seriously wounded, he was immediately appointed Imam. This prompt action by the religious leaders may have saved the Imamati from disintegration. At first he was only recognized around Gyumri, but he used a mixture of force and diplomacy to expand his authority. By the autumn of 1833, he had become powerful enough to worry the Russians. He tried negotiations, but the Russian terms made compromise impossible. In September or October he took Urjbil, which was backed by Russia and several pacified Khanates. The Imamati now surrounded the Khanate of Avaria on 3 sides and conflict was unavoidable. In February to March 1834, Pakubaika tried secretly to have him assassinated. In August 1834, Hamzad laid siege to Kunzik. Pakubaika had defeated the Murids at the Battle of Kunzik in 1830, but this time she saw that resistance was useless. During the negotiations she sent her 8-year-old son to Hamzad as hostage. He was later murdered by Shamil. Hamzad now demanded her 2 older sons. At first she sent one son, then the second. Hamzad hesitated, but Shamil said, "Strike while the iron is hot." On the 13th of August 1834 they were both cut down, one of them, it is said, taking 20 Murids with him. Hamzad's brother was also killed. Hamzad took Kunzik, beheaded Pakubaika and made himself Khan. In August he marched against Sudaka but was checked by the Akusha Confederacy, of which Sudaka was a part. In October Klujana took Urjbil and stormed Gosatel. Haji Murad was a blood brother of one of the murdered princes of Kunzik. By local custom, he had a duty of revenge. On the 7th of September 1834, in the mosque of Kunzik, Hamzad was killed by Haji Murad, his brother and the followers. This led to a general shootout which killed a number of people, including Haji's brother Osman, who had fired the first shot.